Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be talking about something called the cell cycle. Now, we need new cells for growth and to replace damaged tissue. So our body needs cells that are able to make more of themselves essentially. And they do this during the cell cycle. Now the cell cycle is ultimately a process that all body cells from multicellular, that's as in multiple cells, multicellular organisms that use to grow and divide. So we're going to outline what the cell cycle entails and why it's important, particularly in treatment of cancer, because the cell cycle is typically taught at A level in a genetics section. So we're just going to talk about the basic cell cycle here. So just a rough sketch. I'm just going to draw, not the best. Just to start this kind of loop off, I'm going to start here. Okay, so we're going to go round in this direction. So, when a cell wants to essentially grow and then divide, it has to do it in distinct phases. It can't just split immediately. And you find that the first sort of big chunk of this cycle is what we call G1, or the growth 1 phase. It's the first growth phase. So we'll just colour this in just to make it a little bit more distinctive. Now in that growth phase, in that first growth phase, the cell is going to make all of the organelles. It has to synthesize all of the organelles, so the mitochondria, the lysosomes, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticula, all of the different organelles that make up the cell, all the components, all of the proteins required. That's what happens in this first growth phase. After this first growth phase, we're then in position to have what's called an S phase. Now the S phase is also known as the replication phase, and it's almost as if it's in preparation for the cell splitting. Now we can't go from one cell to two and make it identical without having our DNA, our genetic material, double. And that's what happens in this S phase. We replicate, or we copy, make a second copy of all of our genetic material. Now DNA replication I will talk about in more detail in another video, but in this one we're just outlining the basic cell cycle. So you have this first growth phase, then we have the S phase, which is a replicating phase. Then we come to what is our second growth phase. So this is a growth phase 2. Again, we'll just colour this in. Now at this point here, the cell is preparing for mitosis, cell division. So mitosis is cell division in body cells, not to be confused with meiosis, cell division for sperm and egg. So the cell's going to be preparing for mitosis, or cell division. So it's going to form proteins required in mitosis. So in a video about mitosis, I talk about protein spindles. It's going to be forming those. So essentially it's a final growth phase before division. And then finally, we have M, which is our true mitosis or cell division stage. And that's where the cell will split into two to form two identical copies. Now, interestingly, this phase of mitosis only accounts for, it's not shown here, but 2% of this entire cycle. 98% is made up of the G1, S and G2 phase. Now it should be said that G1, S and G2 all make up something called interphase. So whenever you learn about mitosis and cell division in school, you learn about the distinct phases: interphase, prophase, metaphase, etc. Interphase is this entire sort of growing period So sometimes you see G1, S and G2 all called interphase. Now, there is a little extra part to the cell cycle that typically is mentioned once everything sort of here is in place. There is another part called, I'm just thinking of a best way to put this in, called G0. That's not go, that's G0. And G0, I'll just put 2 arrows here, is what we call the quiescent or resting phase. Now, if cells were to enter that G0 or resting or quiescent phase, then essentially they lie dormant. So then they're not actively dividing and not actively growing. Now, interestingly, they do still continue to carry out their function, but they're not actively growing or dividing. They are, as the name says, just resting or lying dormant. Now, cells don't need to go into this phase. They go, as I've drawn with the red arrow at the very beginning, they go from G1 to S to G2 to M, G1, S, G2 to M. They could go off at any point into this G0 or this extra sort of resting period. Now, this is the cell cycle. This is the basics of the cell cycle. The reason why it's important to know is because, well, particularly when you're looking at cancer therapies, because there are certain drugs given as part of chemotherapy that can damage enzymes involved in DNA replication. So if you damage enzymes that are involved in replication, clearly you wouldn't get this S phase, this replication phase. So it's a way of stopping tumour cells growing by stopping or arresting this cell cycle. Equally, radiotherapy in certain drugs can actually damage the DNA. So if the DNA is damaged, you're not going to copy that damaged DNA. So again, you'll stop or arrest this cell cycle, and it's a way of stopping tumour cells growing. In both instances, you almost make the cell destroy itself. If it's damaged, the cell would know to destroy itself. And we give that a special name. It's called apoptosis. A-P-O-P-T-O-S-I-S. Apoptosis. Now, the final thing I want to just mention in this cell cycle video are what are called cell cycle checkpoints. So for this, I'm just going to reduce the screen again because I just want to make it a little bit clearer down here at the bottom. So I'm going to have G1, that would lead on to S, that would lead on to G2 and to M, and then the cycle would go again. Now, there are 4 what are called cell cycle checkpoints, times at which the cell kind of assesses what is going on ultimately, and it's to make sure that everything is correct and in place and that the cell is functioning properly. So the first checkpoint is actually midway through G1. Apologies, I say midway, but it's rather at the end of G1. And it's to make sure that the first phase of growth has happened correctly, that the organelles are forming as they should. So I should really have drawn this red line a little bit further on, but the first checkpoint to make sure everything is okay is at the end of G1. So I'll just add that also to the top picture. We have a checkpoint at the end of the S phase, and that's to make sure that replication has happened correctly. We have our third checkpoint at the end of G2. So at the end of G2, we just check that everything is growing properly and correct, because that's our second to last time we've got to make sure that the cell is able to divide properly. And then our fourth and final checkpoint, which is really important, is actually during mitosis in a phase called metaphase, when the chromosomes line up along the equator of the cell in the middle of the cell. And that's important. In fact, it's critical because that's the last time the cell has to check that it is doing everything correctly, essentially, before the chromosomes start to pull to opposite poles. So that's the last moment we have to check before the cell divides, and it has to continue dividing once we've reached that point. So we have 4 cell cycle checkpoints: at the end of G1, at the end of S, at the end of G2, and just before metaphase of M, mitosis. So that is ultimately our cell cycle. Okay, I hope all that helps.